Minnesota's pandemic fraud scandal has turned into one of the biggest embarrassments in the country, and somehow the people responsible are acting like they just accidentally dropped a cup of coffee instead of letting tens of billions in taxpayer money vanish into thin air. During the pandemic, when the government was basically printing money and handing it out like party favors, scams popped up everywhere. People across America figured out real quick that if you filled out the right form, claimed a business that didn't exist, or pretended to feed kids you'd never met, you could get paid. And while that chaos was happening nationwide, federal auditors came out and said that Minnesota stood out as the worst of the worst, a real record-breaking performance in the let's lose money and pretend we don't know how Olympics. Federal prosecutors have been investigating 59 people already, and that number, according to anyone plugged into the legal side of this, is about to shoot up to 73. Do you know how insane that is? 73 people potentially tied to a giant fraud operation, and we still don't have anyone in government stepping up and saying, yeah, this one's kind of on us. Instead, they send Congresswoman Ilhan Omar on CNN to do damage control, but the interview goes sideways because the host actually asks a real question for once. You can see the discomfort hit instantly when the host says Minnesota's fraud scandal stands out and asks what investigators are saying. Ilhan delivers this calm, polite answer like she's reading from a teleprompter written by her lawyer. She says she's following the cases closely, more indictments are coming, everything is going through the courts, and she's hearing that the number might go up to 73. And she says that like she's giving the weather report instead of talking about the biggest theft in Minnesota's history. No urgency, no outrage, no real explanation, just a politician doing verbal yoga to keep the blame as far away from herself as possible. Then the host goes in again, asking how this fraud got so out of control in Minnesota specifically. And Ilhan Omar launches into the classic things were rushed, mistakes were made, programs were new, and people relied on third parties, excuse alphabet. She blames the speed of the pandemic response, says guardrails didn't get put in place, and basically suggests that the whole thing was just an unfortunate byproduct of trying to help people too quickly. That's like giving your roommate your rent money, watching them blow it in Vegas, and saying, well, you know, things happen fast sometimes. That answer doesn't explain anything. It doesn't tell us who ignored the warning signs. It doesn't tell us who approved shady groups to handle millions. It doesn't tell us why absolutely nobody checked whether the money was going where it was supposed to. Her explanation wasn't an explanation, it was a giant shrug disguised as a sentence. And you can literally feel the public screaming back at the screen, hold up, you're the congresswoman for that district. It's your job to know who is getting federal funds. It's your job to ask questions before signing checks. It's your job to look out for taxpayers. If billions were stolen on your watch, how is that not your responsibility? Because in the real world, if you manage a store and money disappears, you're fired before you even get a chance to pack your lunch. You're accountable because that's what leadership means. But in politics, accountability is a word people like to use during campaigns and then hide from as soon as anything goes wrong. Ilhan's whole attitude in that interview boiled down to, don't look at me, look at the chaos. It's the same exact thing we hear from commentators like Rachel Maddow. Whenever there's a disaster caused by decision makers, they act like the world is just too complicated. Problems are too complex, and we should all just throw our hands up and accept it instead of expecting actual answers. That is the political hustle. If nobody knows who to blame, then nobody gets punished. It's a scam, the confusion scam. Politicians intentionally drag everything into this foggy gray zone where consequences can't find them. And that's exactly what Ilhan did during that CNN interview. She turned one of the worst fraud cases in US history into a vague accident that mysteriously happened without a single person making a bad decision. But here's the truth that she didn't say. This had nothing to do with the pandemic being messy and everything to do with the system being wide open for abuse. When the government chooses to funnel money through third-party organizations without oversight, without audits, without verification, what exactly did they think was going to happen? This wasn't a surprise twist in the story. It was the plot from day one. And instead of admitting that lack of oversight came from elected officials who wanted these programs to move fast so they could brag about how much they were helping, she pretends like everyone did their best and a bunch of criminals just magically slipped through. But these weren't accidental criminals. They weren't confused people filling out paperwork wrong. They were coordinated scammers filing fake documents, building fake businesses, and laundering money through sham organizations. They didn't stumble into billions, they targeted because the door was left wide open. And why was the door open? Because the people with the keys never bothered to lock it. The most insulting part is that Ilhan Omar doesn't even attempt to show frustration about what happened. There's no apology for failing to protect taxpayer money. There's no commitment to fixing anything. There's no statement like, this was unacceptable and we are taking direct action. Instead, she gives the PR safe version of, oh, well, things were chaotic. You know how it goes. That's not leadership. That's escape artistry. And you can tell that she's annoyed during the interview, not because the scandal is so massive, but because someone is finally holding a microphone in front of her and expecting an explanation. Politicians hate being asked real questions. They love talking points, not accountability. They love blaming the system, not owning their role in it. And that's the real reason this scandal matters. It's not just about the money, although billions disappearing is insane enough. It's about the mindset behind the theft. It shows us that we have a government that creates fragile, easily abused systems, then plays dumb when people predictably abuse them. Fraud isn't a glitch. Fraud is what happens when leaders prioritize speed over oversight and photo ops over responsibility. They want to be the hero who got money out fast, but the second that hero narrative backfires, they become the confused bystander who has no idea how everything fell apart. That's why Ilhan's answers are so frustrating. They reveal that this wasn't just a failure, it was a failure with no consequences attached. Investigators are doing their job good. Scammers will go to court great. But what about the elected officials who set the stage for the greatest heist Minnesota has ever seen? Why do they get to shrug and keep their jobs? Why do they get to pretend they had nothing to do with the disaster they oversaw? Why do they get to act like spectators in something they helped create? In any job that actually matters, results matter. If a surgeon messes up a surgery, if a pilot crashes a plane, if a bank manager loses millions, there is accountability. But if a politician's failure leads to billions stolen from the public, they go on CNN and explain calmly that guardrails didn't exist. Isn't that exactly the point? Whose job was it to create those guardrails? They talk like these systems built themselves. Like policies just float in on the breeze. Like money just magically distributes itself with no human involvement. It's insulting. It's irresponsible. And honestly, it's a huge part of why the public doesn't trust political leaders anymore. Because they act like they care about helping people, but when the money is stolen right out of the programs meant to help those people, their tone shifts to, well, we tried our best, what can you do? At this point, Americans aren't even shocked that the fraud happened. We've seen enough corruption to know how the game works. What shocks people, what annoys people, is the complete lack of ownership. The politicians at the center of this scandal don't seem embarrassed or ashamed. They seem irritated that they have to answer for any of it at all. Ilhan Omar visibly did not want those questions asked. She wanted the interview where she gets to project calm competence, where she gets to pretend everything is under control, where nothing is her fault, because the whole strategy is to make chaos the villain so the audience doesn't look too closely at the person holding the steering wheel. That's how the political class survives, not through results, but through avoidance. Avoid the details, avoid the follow-ups, avoid the blame, and most importantly, avoid consequences. Because if you let one politician be held responsible, suddenly you open the door for accountability across the board, and that is what terrifies them the most. They depend on a world where no one ever actually pays the price for failure. And that's why this interview hits different. It shows that when real questions show up, the excuses come out. Minnesota didn't become the center of a historic fraud accident. It became the center of a historic oversight failure. And that failure belonged to people who were too distracted, too careless, or too comfortable to enforce basic protection of public funds. Billions disappeared, gone, and all we got was a PR answer about new programs and missing guardrails. That is unacceptable, because if politicians can't handle accountability, they shouldn't have authority. If they can't safeguard money, they shouldn't be allowed to allocate it. And if they can't accept responsibility, they shouldn't be representing anyone. That's what leadership means. And until that standard exists, again, scandals like Minnesota's will keep happening, the money will keep disappearing, and same politicians will keep going on TV with that same annoyed expression, bothered not by the fraud itself, but by the fact that someone finally dared to ask why.